I ironed my blouse twice before leaving the house, the way Henry always liked it, crisp at the collar. In the passenger seat sat the pecan pie I had baked that morning, still carrying the faint warmth of the oven. It had been his favorite, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it would soften whatever edges the evening might hold. Gareth's house glowed like a magazine spread, all glass and stone, the kind of place you buy to prove you've made it. When I rang the bell, he opened the door with a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. Veronica trailed behind him, heels clicking, her perfume sharp enough to sting. Their teenagers glanced at me the way you might glance at an old neighbor whose name you can't quite recall. Dinner began with clinking glasses and the clatter of silver. Gareth raised his wine and said, almost too casually, "We've decided it's best to simplify things." My stomach tightened. I asked, careful not to sound defensive, whether he'd spoken to the lawyer about the trust. Before Gareth could answer, Veronica smirked and looked at me over her phone. "You're just the widow. Eleonora, maybe stay quiet for once." The table laughed, even Trevor, my quieter son, let out a chuckle. My face burned, but I forced my hands to remain steady on the fork. Then came the blow that cut deeper than the insult. Veronica, thinking herself clever, bragged that their realtor already had documents in order to list my home. My home the colonial Henry and I had bought in 1979, the place where every sacrifice had been made. She called it streamlining the portfolio. I felt the room tilt. My chest clenched with something that was not grief this time, but raw fury. I pushed back my chair, lifted the pie with shaking hands, and stood without a word. As I reached the door, I heard Gareth mutter, "She'll come around," outside, in the stillness of my car. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. If they thought I was disposable, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The road home was lined with trees blackened against the fading sky, their branches tangled like the years Henry and I had spent building a life from scraps. I kept the headlights low, letting the quiet Connecticut backroads swallow the noise of Gareth's laughter still echoing in my ears. My son's words replayed in a cruel loop. "You're just the widow." I thought of those early years with Henry, when vacations were an impossible luxury. We worked double shifts, ate canned soup 3 nights a week, and mortgaged every bit of security we had just to help Gareth start his first business. Veronica, who never knew hunger or sacrifice, wore arrogance like a jewel-toned perfume, intoxicating, but poisonous. By the time I turned into my driveway, the night air felt heavier than my chest. My colonial stood as it always had, shutters peeling, porch light flickering, but Henry's azaleas still bloomed stubbornly along the fence. They greeted me like faithful companions. Inside, the silence hit harder than the insult. I sank into Henry's recliner, the one seat that still held the weight of his memory. I pulled his old throw blanket over my shoulders, frayed edges brushing my fingers, and for a moment I could hear him laughing at some late-night rerun. My eyes burned, but the tears dried into anger. Gareth's voice cut through the quiet, "Just the widow." But then Henry's words returned, the way he'd say them whenever bills piled up or hope ran thin. "You're the spine of this family. Never forget." I wondered if he had seen this betrayal coming, if he had left me something more than memories. Sleep would not come. At 2:15 a.m., restless, I walked across the hall to the cabinet we had always called the no-go drawer. My fingers brushed dust from passports, tax files, brittle deeds. Then, wedged behind the stack, a white envelope surfaced. Henry's neat script spelled one word, Eleonora. My hands shook. Henry had never been one for letters. Inside this envelope lay something he had kept hidden, perhaps for this very moment. I carried the envelope to the kitchen, and set it beneath the warm glow of the lamp. My fingers hesitated before sliding the flap open. As though once opened, it could never be closed again. Inside, a single sheet of Henry's handwriting greeted me, steady and deliberate. The voice of a man who always planned 3 steps ahead. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. The boys love themselves more than family. Veronica is worse. I transferred everything, house, accounts, properties, into your name. You alone hold power. Don't let them shame you. If they try, burn it all down. I read it twice, then again, each time hearing him more clearly, as if he were standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, stubborn and protective. Behind the letter was a stack of documents clipped neatly together. My breath caught as I scanned the seals, property deeds, revisions to the trust, power of attorney, all signed and notarized 8 months before his last breath. Henry had dissolved the estate board they thought would protect them. He had placed everything in my hands. The tears that spilled onto the paper weren't from grief this time. They burned with gratitude, with the sudden recognition that I had never been left defenseless. I spread the documents across the table, aligning them like a battlefield map. Gareth's polished empire, his wine-soaked dinners. His house with glass walls had been propped up by my silence. That silence ended tonight. As dawn bled through the curtains, I dialed Alan Kramer. His voice was thick with sleep until I said, "Henry left everything to me. I want to activate it today." A pause, then a crisp answer. "I'll be there by 9. I hung up and walked to the bathroom. The mirror showed someone I barely recognized. I showered, pinned back my hair, pressed lipstick to my mouth with steady hands. When I looked again, I didn't see a widow in mourning. I saw a woman carrying a weapon no one expected. At exactly 8:59 a.m., Alan Kramer stepped into my kitchen. The same man who had guided Henry and me through 30 years of taxes and deeds. His leather briefcase hit the table with a familiar thud, but his eyes carried a sharper weight when I slid Henry's envelope toward him. He read in silence, adjusting his glasses, then pressed his lips into a line of respect. "Henry was meticulous," he said finally. "This is airtight." For 2 hours we went line by line, clause by clause, his pen scratching notes while my heart pounded in my chest. By 11:15, 6 signatures bore my name on properties, on accounts, on every legal tether that had once bound me to silence. Even Gareth's precious business credit line, the one he waved like a badge of independence, was now in my control. When Alan called the estate manager, his voice was crisp. No hesitation. "From this moment, all instructions come from Mrs. Eleonora Whitmore." Hearing it aloud felt like both armor and a knife. Power sat heavy on my shoulders, and fear laced through it. But it was mine. He closed his folder and asked gently, "Do you want them notified directly?" I shook my head. "Steady. Let them feel it. Like a car crash." His smile was brief, grim, but approving. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. "Gareth, weird question. Why is the cabin account locked?" I placed the phone face down on the counter. Minutes later, Veronica's name flashed, her syrupy tone already breaking in the voicemail. I didn't listen. By evening, the group chat erupted. Card declined. Business account frozen. What happened? I stood at the cabinet, slid Henry's envelope back into its drawer, and rested my hand on the wood. They buried me too soon. I whispered into the quiet house, and for the first time, it felt like the walls were listening. By morning, Gareth's kingdom was already faltering. His employees called one after another. Voices strained with panic over missing payroll deposits. Veronica tried to swipe her card at a boutique and returned home red-faced, blaming the machine when she knew better. Even their eldest, usually too aloof to notice anything, muttered across the dinner table that his tuition payment had bounced. I sat at my own kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the cardinals dive in and out of Henry's azaleas. The garden felt alive, protective. For years, this house had seemed like a quiet cell. Now it felt like a fortress. Walls braced by secrets Henry had left in my care. But power was never without burden. Alan called mid-morning, his tone clipped. Your son leveraged certain assets heavily. If you want to keep control, we have to act quickly. I didn't hesitate. Do it. I told him. I'll face them myself. By mid-afternoon, I walked up the stone path to Gareth's front door with a manila folder pressed to my chest. The same path I had walked countless times as a guest. Now, as the one who held the keys to his fate, Gareth opened the door. Eyes ringed with exhaustion, mouth tight with something close to fear. Inside, Veronica leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded like a barricade. Trevor hovered in the hallway, unsure whether to join or retreat. I laid the folder flat on the marble counter and opened it with deliberate calm. This, I said, tapping the stack of papers, is the new estate plan. Everything is under my name. Gareth gave a sharp, humorless laugh. You can't move money without the trust's board. I met his eyes and answered evenly. There is no board. Henry dissolved it. Veronica's manicured fingers slid a page toward her. She froze when she saw Alan's seal stamped in blue ink. The silence that followed was thicker than any argument. For the first time in years, they had nothing left to say. Alan returned 2 days later, his face drawn tight, the kind of look he only wore when something was beyond repair. He laid a file across my table and opened it without ceremony. Your son forged extensions on Henry's business line of credit. Nearly $500,000 siphoned off. Dates match when Henry was in and out of the hospital. The words hollowed me out. I stared at the figures. The signatures, the stamps. Cold fury slid into my veins. I thought of Veronica flaunting ski trip photos from Aspen, the glossy remodel, the SUV gleaming in their driveway. All of it funded by theft from a man who was fighting for his life. Henry had suspected. I pulled out his old journal, still tucked in the desk, and there it was, scrawled in his neat, slanted script. Blake's withdrawals look fishy. Ask Alan. He hadn't lived long enough to follow through. Now it burned like a command in my hands. Alan leaned back. We can press charges, or we can let him stew. Let the financial collapse do the work. I closed the folder. My voice steady. Not yet. I want him broke before he's scared. That night, I sat at my kitchen table making a second folder. Across the front, in thick black marker, I wrote one word firewood. Inside, I placed copies of every fraudulent document, every stamped proof of betrayal. The weekend came, and with it, their desperate attempt at normalcy. Gareth fired up the grill. Neighbors invited for show. Veronica dressed in white like she was still the queen of something. I arrived uninvited, pearls shining at my throat, and laid the folder on the picnic table. This, I said evenly. Opening the pages is what Gareth did while your father was dying. Gasps rippled through the yard. Veronica shrieked denial, but I silenced her with one sharp line. Henry saw it. He didn't trust you to fix it. Trevor's face blanched. Gareth muttered bitterly. You'll burn the family down over paperwork. I leaned forward, my voice low and final. No, you did that when you robbed your father's grave. The morning after the barbecue, I found Veronica pounding on my porch steps, sunglasses hiding nothing of her fury. Her voice cut sharp through the azaleas. Why would Henry do this to us? I opened the door just wide enough to meet her glare. My voice was calm, steady. Maybe because he knew what you'd do in front of it. Then I closed the door and let her anger dissolve into the silence of the street. That night, the phone rang past midnight. Trevor's voice came low, like he was afraid his wife might overhear. "Mom, I didn't know about any of this. I thought the trust was automatic." His words begged for absolution. I answered, with none. "Your silence was your signature." There was a pause, heavy with shame. Then the line went dead. Within days, his own cracks began to show. The rental condo he'd been using for side income traced back to Henry's estate. He called again, desperate this time. "Please, don't take the kids home. They don't deserve this." I listened, torn between the son I raised and the man who stood idle while I was humiliated. Was this repentance, or just self-preservation dressed in guilt? Meanwhile, Gareth was unraveling faster. Alan called to warn me. "Your son is reaching out to dangerous people. If he drags in loan sharks, things could turn ugly." The words chilled me, but they only strengthened my resolve. I moved quickly. The lake house Gareth boasted about on Instagram sold. The SUV Veronica paraded around town, repossessed by afternoon. Neighbors whispered behind curtains as trucks rolled away their illusions, one possession at a time. Back in my kitchen, I roasted a chicken for one, the smell filling a house that had always felt too quiet. I poured a glass of wine, lifted it toward Henry's framed photo, and whispered, "I'm not burning it down. I'm cleaning house." The flames of betrayal had already scorched enough. Now, it was my turn to clear the rubble. The house was quiet when the landline rang, its shrill tone cutting through the evening. I lifted the receiver and heard a trembling voice I recognized instantly. "Grandma, are you okay? Mom and Dad are freaking out. They say money's gone. The house is in trouble." It was Ava, Gareth and Veronica's 17-year-old daughter. My chest softened in a way it hadn't in weeks. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong." There was a pause. Then a whisper. "I miss Grandpa. He'd hate this." The words lodged in my throat. I swallowed hard before answering. That's why he fixed it before it broke. For the first time since Henry's death, I saw a flicker of a future untainted by greed. Ava's voice carried no entitlement, only fear and honesty. Unlike her parents, she still had integrity untouched by the rot around her. But peace never lasts long in a family like mine. 2 days later, an envelope appeared under my door. No return address. Just my name typed in block letters. Inside was a psychiatric evaluation request, stamped with aggressive red ink capacity. Evaluation recommended. I knew a setup when I saw one. Alan traced it quickly. Veronica had bribed a notary, tried to backdate documents, and pushed for a challenge to my authority. This time, the law moved faster than her schemes. Forgery charges were filed, and a sheriff's cruiser pulled into their driveway on a bright afternoon. Neighbors gathered in clusters, pretending to garden as Veronica was cuffed in full view, screaming that it was all a mistake. That evening, the phone rang again. Ava's voice was quieter, edged with shame. She tried to blame you, but nobody believed her. Not even Dad. I sat there in silence, the weight of it pressing down. In a family drowning in lies, Ava's truth was the only thing left floating. She was the only Whitmore still worth saving. And as I set the phone back in its cradle, I knew the choices I made next would shape her life as much as my own. With Veronica's arrest still echoing through the neighborhood gossip and Gareth sunk into silence, I felt the shift in the air. Revenge no longer guided me. Rebuilding did. The first step was simple. I signed over the deed to the little yellow shuttered house on the edge of town. The one Henry always said reminded him of his grandmother's place. I handed the papers to Ava across my kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she read her name printed where mine had once been. Tears slid down her cheeks. "I don't deserve this." "You do," I told her, squeezing her fingers. "Because you never pretended." Her sob broke something loose in me. For once, the future of this family didn't feel poisoned. At the same time, I began the paperwork for the Henry Whitmore Second Chance Fund, a grant designed for widows over 60 abandoned by their families. The very first letter arrived before the ink on the articles was dry a woman in Kentucky whose children drained her bank account the day after her husband's funeral. I approved her request without hesitation, imagining Henry's nod of approval over my shoulder. Meanwhile, Gareth's fortress cracked. Notices for foreclosure tacked up on his gates. Creditors circling like vultures. Trevor stumbled too, his investments unraveling until bankruptcy loomed. I didn't gloat. Their ruin wasn't my prize. My prize was knowing Henry's work. Our work wasn't wasted on greed. Then Gareth tried once more. A message came, inviting me to a reset dinner. I went, not for reconciliation, but because sometimes presence itself is power. I walked into the dining room with Ava beside me, her shoulders squared. Gareth stammered through a speech about storms and how families weather them differently. I raised a hand and cut him off. This isn't a storm. It's the consequence. And every one of you wrote it. Silence blanketed the table. Thicker than any argument could be. I sat back, my granddaughter's hand warm in mine, already knowing the final step I needed to take would not be about destruction, but transformation. Weeks later, I stood on my porch watching contractors mend the fence Henry and I had patched 100 times before with our own hands. The boards went up straighter this time, the posts deeper, as if even the ground understood it was being asked to hold something sturdier than memory. I had sold off the properties that served no purpose but vanity, keeping only what I needed to live modestly. With the rest, I bought back a run-down farmhouse just outside town, the place Henry and I once dreamed of retiring. I could have lived there quietly, hidden away with my savings and silence, but I had learned too much about what silence costs. Instead, I stripped the place to its bones and built it back into something alive. Wide gardens were tilled for vegetables. Upstairs, rooms painted bright and welcoming. At the ribbon cutting, women stood with me, widows with stories like mine, voices often dismissed, hands stronger than anyone cared to see. Ava held the ladder while I hammered in the wooden sign above the porch house of hope. She smiled through tears when I climbed down beside her. Reporters asked why I hadn't kept the fortune for myself. I answered plainly, because a fortune kept in fear rots. A fortune shared in dignity grows. That evening, I walked past the same polished dining table where I had once been told to sit down and stay quiet. The echo of my own words came back to me. I was always the builder. Later, I carried a mug of coffee to the porch of my colonial. Henry's azaleas blooming stubbornly along the fence. The air was crisp. The sky stretched wide. I set the mug down, touched the petals, and whispered, "You don't have to worry anymore." My story had not ended in revenge. It had ended in rebirth. The widow they silenced now spoke not just for herself, but for all the others still waiting to be heard.